My name is Guy Holt. I am 69 years old, and I need to tell you something that took me 4 years to understand. You can do the right thing and lose everything that matters to you. And you can still, if you are patient enough, find a way to make it mean something. This is that story. The text came on a Tuesday morning in April, 11 weeks before my granddaughter Emma's graduation from the University of Vermont. I was at the kitchen table with coffee and the financial statements I had been reviewing for a consulting client. The kind of work I still did 2 or 3 times a year because 35 years of forensic accounting does not leave you easily, and because the work kept my mind moving in the ways it needed to move. I heard the notification. I picked up the phone. The text was from Megan. It said, "Dad, please don't come to Emma's graduation. It would make things uncomfortable for everyone. I hope you understand." I set the phone on the table. I looked at the coffee. I looked at the financial statements. Through the kitchen window, I could see the backyard where Emma had played as a child during the summers she spent with me and her grandmother Carol before Carol passed. The yard where I had taught Emma to identify the difference between a legitimate expense and a fraudulent one using the receipts from our grocery shopping, which had been a game we had played since she was 9 years old and which she had told me, at 17, was the reason she had decided to study accounting. Emma was graduating with a degree in accounting in 11 weeks, and her mother had just asked me not to be there. I put the phone face down on the table. I thought about the text for a long time. Then I picked up the phone again and I called my attorney. Not because I needed legal advice, because Richard Chen had been my attorney for 20 years and he was the person I called when I needed to think out loud with someone who would tell me the truth. I told him about the text. He said, "Guy, what do you want to do?" I said, "I want to go to my granddaughter's graduation." He said, "Then we need to talk about what you're going to do between now and then." I said, "I already know what I'm going to do." He said, "Tell me." I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been planning this?" I said, 3 months. This is the story of what happens when a daughter forgets that her father spent 35 years finding things that people believed were hidden. My name is Guy Holt. I am 69 years old. I was born in Burlington, Vermont, the son of a high school mathematics teacher who believed that numbers did not lie and that the ability to read them accurately was among the most important skills a person could develop. He taught me to balance a checkbook at 8 years old and to read a financial statement at 12 and to understand, by the time I left for college, that the story a set of numbers tells is always more complete and more honest than the story the person presenting those numbers wants you to hear. I studied accounting at the University of Vermont, spent 3 years at a mid-size firm in Burlington learning the standard practice, and then moved into forensic accounting in 1989 when a colleague asked me to assist with an internal investigation at a regional manufacturing company that suspected a senior manager of embezzlement. The investigation took 8 weeks. The manager had been stealing for 6 years. The method was intricate and the concealment was good, but not good enough. I found what I found and I documented it, and I presented it to the company's board, and the board referred the matter to the appropriate authorities, and the manager was charged and eventually convicted. The experience of that investigation, the particular satisfaction of following a financial trail to where it actually led regardless of where it appeared to lead, confirmed something I had suspected for 3 years. Forensic accounting was the work I was meant to do. I founded Holt Forensic Consulting in 1992 with 2 colleagues. Over 30 years, it grew into a firm with 12 specialists and a client list that included law firms, insurance companies, corporate boards, and on several occasions, federal and state agencies that needed independent expertise in complex financial fraud cases. I retired 4 years ago, at 65, and sold my interest in the firm to my partners on terms that had been agreed for years and that produced a retirement that was comfortable without being extravagant. I still consulted occasionally because the work was interesting and because complete idleness did not suit me and because there are problems that require a specific kind of experience that does not fully transfer to younger practitioners, and those problems still found me even in retirement. I lived in the house in Burlington where Carol and I had lived for 28 years. The house had more room than one person needed, which I had understood since the week after Carol's funeral and which I had decided to make peace with rather than solve by moving somewhere smaller, because the house was where Carol had lived and I was not ready to live somewhere she had not. Carol passed 6 years ago. Lung cancer, non-smoker, the kind of diagnosis that makes no sense to anyone, including the doctors. She was 62 years old and we had been married for 38 years, and she had been, in every meaningful sense, the person who made the rest of my life possible while I spent my professional life finding what other people had hidden. Carol found things too. She found the humanity in situations that my professional training inclined me to see purely as numbers problems. She kept me honest in ways that had nothing to do with accounting. I have one child. Megan is 44 years old. She lives in Montpelier with her husband Scott and their daughter Emma, who is 22 years old and who graduated from the University of Vermont with a degree in accounting on a Saturday in June that I was asked not to attend. Megan is my daughter. She has Carol's warmth and my precision and a capacity for loyalty that is, in most circumstances, one of her finest qualities. She grew up watching me do the work, understanding from an early age that her father spent his professional life finding things that people had tried to hide, and she had always expressed pride in that without reservations. Until 4 years ago. The circumstances that concern this story are the exception. She and Scott have been married for 19 years. Scott is 47 years old and he runs a regional commercial insurance brokerage that he built from a small operation he inherited from his father into a business with 22 employees and a client list covering most of northern Vermont. He is a competent businessman and a decent father to Emma, and he has been, in 19 years of being my son-in-law, consistently cordial without ever being warm, which is a distinction I noticed early and filed away without particular concern. 4 years ago, that distinction became relevant in a way I had not anticipated. Scott had a business partner named Dennis Farrell. Dennis and Scott had built the brokerage together for 11 years, with Dennis managing the financial operations of the firm while Scott managed the client relationships. The arrangement worked because their skills were complementary, and because they trusted each other, or at least because Scott trusted Dennis, which is a different thing. I came to know about Dennis Farrell's activities at the brokerage through work. A law firm that had represented one of the brokerage's commercial clients engaged Holt Forensic to conduct a financial review of the client's insurance arrangements after the client suspected they were being systematically overcharged on their premiums. The engagement was presented to me as a routine review. I accepted it as such. I did not know at the time that the brokerage in question was the one Scott and Dennis ran. I discovered this approximately 2 weeks into the review, by which point the financial trail I was following had already begun to show me things that could not be unseen. What it found was a pattern of fraudulent billing that had been running for 7 years and that had been concealed through a method that was reasonably sophisticated and that had survived several internal reviews because the person responsible for those internal reviews was the same person responsible for the fraud. Dennis Farrell had been systematically overbilling the brokerage's commercial clients and redirecting the excess to accounts he controlled. The total, over 7 years, was approximately $430,000. I found this. I documented it. I presented it to the law firm that had engaged me and recommended they refer the matter to the appropriate authorities, which was my professional and legal obligation when evidence of fraud was identified in the course of an engagement. They referred it. Dennis Farrell was charged. The investigation that followed the referral examined the brokerage's operations thoroughly and found no evidence that Scott had been involved in or aware of the fraud. Scott was cleared. Dennis was convicted and sentenced. But the investigation had been public. The brokerage's clients had learned about it. Some of them had left. The firm had lost revenue in the year of the investigation, and in the year following that it had taken time and significant effort to recover. Scott had spent 2 years rebuilding what the investigation had damaged, and Megan had decided that the damage was my fault. I want to be precise about what happened over the 4 years between the Dennis Farrell matter and the graduation text, because the precision matters. In the first year, Megan and I spoke less frequently than we had before. The calls that had come every Sunday became bi-weekly and then monthly. The holiday dinners became smaller and more careful. When I asked Megan directly whether she was angry with me, she said no. She understood I had done what I had to do, and then she changed the subject. I believed her the first time. I stopped believing her around the 6th month. In the second year, the calls stopped. I called. Megan answered and was polite and brief. I asked about Emma, who was in her second year at UVM. Megan gave me updates that were accurate but minimal. Scott was never mentioned. I drove to Montpelier in October of the second year and had dinner with Megan alone at a restaurant downtown, a dinner I had asked for specifically. She came. She was warm in the way of someone maintaining warmth through an act of will. Halfway through dinner, I said, "Megan, I need you to tell me what you actually think about what happened with Dennis Farrell." She set down her fork. She said, "Dad, Scott lost 3 of his biggest clients. He spent 18 months rebuilding. It was the hardest 2 years of our marriage." I said, "I know." She said, "You could have handled it differently." I said, "I could not have. I had a legal and professional obligation to report what I found. Not reporting it would have been a crime." She said, "You could have talked to Scott first." I said, "Megan, if I had talked to Scott first, I would have compromised the investigation and potentially violated the terms of my engagement. Dennis had been stealing from clients. Those clients deserved to know," she said. "Scott deserved to know first." I said, "The law does not agree with you." She looked at her plate. We finished dinner. She hugged me outside the restaurant with the particular hug of someone who has said what they needed to say and is not going to say more. In the third year, I saw Emma twice, both times without Megan and Scott present. Both times in Burlington, where Emma came to have lunch with me between semesters. Emma was studying hard and doing well, and she talked about her accounting courses with the enthusiasm of someone who has found the work they were meant to do. I did not discuss her parents. She did not either. In the 4th year, the calls from Megan stopped entirely. I called every 2 weeks. She answered approximately half the time. The conversations were cordial and brief. I was not invited to Thanksgiving. I was invited to Christmas and came and sat at the table and talked to Scott about the brokerage and talked to Megan about nothing in particular and sat next to Emma, who was home from her final semester and who told me about her thesis on forensic accounting methods in insurance fraud detection, which she had chosen in honor of me without saying she had chosen it in honor of me, which I understood and appreciated. 3 months after Christmas, I received the text. I had been planning what I did for 3 months before the text arrived. The text did not change the plan. The text confirmed that the plan was necessary. Emma's student loan balance at the University of Vermont was, as of the beginning of her final semester, $41,200. I knew this because Emma had mentioned the number at Christmas in the context of discussing what she expected her starting salary to be and how long it would take her to pay off her loans. She had mentioned it matter-of-factly, the way young people who have grown up with debt discuss it, as a given condition of their lives, rather than as a problem with a solution. She had calculated that at her expected starting salary it would take her approximately 4 years to clear the debt while maintaining reasonable living expenses. She had described this timeline without complaint, as though 4 years of debt repayment was simply the cost of the education, which it was, and which she accepted without resentment. I had sat at that Christmas table and listened to my granddaughter describe 4 years of debt repayment as an expected condition of her life, and I had thought about the retirement income. Sitting in accounts I would not fully spend in the years I had remaining, and I had made a decision that I did not announce. I had not said anything at Christmas. I had listened and I had thought about what she had said for 2 weeks after Christmas, and then I had called Richard. I said, Richard, I want to pay off Emma's student loans. He said, all of them? I said, all of them. Without telling her, without telling Megan, without telling anyone. I want it done before graduation. He said, Guy, why before graduation? I said, because I am not going to be at the graduation, and I want Emma to know on that day that something has happened that she will need to understand. Richard said, you think Megan will tell her not to contact you? I said, I think it is possible. I want Emma to have a reason to contact me that does not depend on Megan's permission. Richard said, that's a significant amount of money. I said, I know what it is. He said, when do you want to do this? I said, now. Richard handled the mechanics over the following week. He contacted the loan servicer, confirmed the exact payoff amount, and arranged the transfer from my account. The loans were paid in full on a Wednesday morning in February, 10 weeks before graduation. Emma received a notification from her loan servicer. The notification said her balance had been paid in full by an anonymous third-party payment. Loan servicers do not disclose the identity of third-party payers without the payer's authorization, and I had not authorized disclosure. Emma did not know who had paid her loans. She knew someone had. She called her parents. She called her friends. She did not call me, perhaps because it did not occur to her that I would do something of this magnitude without announcing it. Perhaps because 4 years of managed distance had moved me to the outer edge of the people she would think to call first. Then the graduation text arrived. I did not go to the graduation. I respected Megan's request because Emma's graduation day was Emma's day, and I was not willing to make it about the difficulty between her mother and me. I had thought about going anyway. I had thought about it for the 11 weeks between the text and the ceremony. I had imagined arriving at the auditorium and finding a seat in the back and watching Emma walk across the stage without anyone knowing I was there. I had imagined Megan seeing me and what her face would do. I did not go. I stayed in Burlington. I walked along the waterfront in the morning where Carol and I had walked on Sunday mornings for 20 years, and I sat in the park near the lake in the afternoon, and I thought about Emma standing in her cap and gown accepting her diploma, with the particular posture she had inherited from Carol, straight and unhurried, and I was glad for her even though I was not there to be glad in person. Being glad for someone does not require being present. I had learned this during the 4 years of distance, and I had not liked learning it, but I had learned it. At 4:17 in the afternoon, my phone rang. The number was Emma's. I answered. She said, Grandpa. I said, Emma. She said, it was you. I said, yes. She said, $41,000. I said, $41,200. She was quiet for a moment. I could hear background noise behind her, voices and movement, the aftermath of a ceremony. She said, Mom just told me you weren't invited. I said, I know. She said, she told me after the ceremony. She said she had asked you not to come because it would have been uncomfortable. I said, I know that too. She said, I didn't know you weren't coming until I was already in my seat. I said, I'm sorry you found out that way. She said, Grandpa, why didn't you tell me? I said, about the loans or about not coming? She said, either. Both. I said, about the loans because it was a gift, and gifts don't require explanation. About not coming because it was your day, and I didn't want you thinking about me instead of what you had accomplished. She was quiet again. I heard her moving, stepping away from the crowd. She said, I wrote my thesis on forensic accounting methods in insurance fraud detection. I said, I know. Your mother told me at Christmas. She said, I wrote it about a case from 4 years ago, a commercial insurance brokerage in northern Vermont, an internal fraud investigation that identified systematic overbilling by a financial officer. I was quiet. She said, I know what happened, Grandpa. I figured it out in my 2nd year. I read the public records. I understood what you did and why you did it. I said, Emma. She said, You did the right thing. I said, yes. She said, Dad lost clients because his partner was stealing from them. That's not your fault. I said, your mother sees it differently. She said, I know how Mom sees it. A pause. I'm going to come to Burlington next weekend. Is that all right? I said, yes. That is very much all right. She said, I'll bring the thesis. I said, I would like to read it. She said, Grandpa, thank you. For the loans and for everything else. I said, you earned the degree. I just removed an obstacle. She laughed. It was Carol's laugh, the specific quality of it, and for a moment the afternoon was very full. Emma came to Burlington the following weekend. We spent 2 days talking about accounting and about the thesis and about what she wanted to do with her career and about Dennis Farrell and what the investigation had involved and what my professional obligations had required. I explained everything I had not been able to explain to Megan because Megan had not wanted to hear it. Emma listened with the particular quality of attention that she had been developing since she was 9 years old, sorting grocery receipts at the kitchen table. On the second evening, she said, I'm going to talk to Mom. I said, Emma, that is between you and your mother. I don't want you to feel obligated. She said, I don't feel obligated. I feel like she needs to hear some things. I said, what things? She said, that what you did was right, and that 4 years is long enough. I said, Emma. She said, Grandpa, you paid off $41,000 of my debt, and you didn't come to my graduation because she told you not to. That is not something I am going to ignore. I said, I made my own decision not to come. She asked, and I could have said no. She said, why didn't you? I said, because making a scene at your graduation was not something I was willing to do. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, that's very you. Megan called me 3 weeks after graduation. Emma had spoken with her. I do not know what was said between them because it was not mine to know. But Megan's voice when she called had the particular quality of someone who has been through a conversation that required her to hear things she had been avoiding. She said, Dad. I said, Megan. She said, I owe you an apology. I said, you don't have to. She said, I do. 4 years. I was wrong. I said, you were angry. That is different from wrong. She said, I was wrong about what you did. Emma made me read the case records. I understood what I didn't understand before. I said, I should have explained it better 4 years ago. She said, you tried. I didn't let you. We were quiet for a moment. She said, Scott is still angry. I said, I know. She said he might always be angry. I said, that is his right. She said, but I'm not angry anymore. I said, I know. I can hear it. Scott and I have not spoken directly since the investigation. I do not expect that to change soon. Some distances take longer to cross than others, and some may not be crossable at all, and I have made a kind of peace with that understanding without fully reconciling myself to it. Megan and I speak every week now. The Sunday calls have come back in the way that things come back when the reason they stopped has been addressed. We talk about Emma, who has taken a position at an accounting firm in Burlington and who comes for dinner every other week and who is very good at her work. We talk about Carol, which we had not done for 4 years because it had been too painful to share that grief across the distance. We talk about ordinary things. Emma brought her thesis to dinner last month. I read it in the chair by the window where I do most of my reading. The same chair where I read manuscripts during the cold press years and where I have read case files and financial statements for 3 decades and where I now read for the pleasure of reading. The thesis was 78 pages. I read every word. It was excellent work. The methodology was sound and the analysis was careful and the conclusions were precise without being overstated. She had approached the Dennis Farrell investigation with the same combination of patience and attention that forensic work requires, following each financial thread to where it actually led rather than where it appeared to lead. She had understood not only what had been done, but why the concealment had worked for as long as it had, and what structural changes would have caught it sooner. Her recommendations in the final chapter were the kind of practical, implementable guidance that most academic work fails to produce. I made notes in the margins. There were many of them. She had dedicated it to Carol, and to me, not by name, by initials. C, H, and G. H. I looked at those initials for a long time before I turned the page. I am 69 years old. I spent 35 years doing work that required me to follow a financial trail wherever it led, regardless of where it appeared to lead, regardless of whose interests were complicated by what I found, regardless of the personal cost of the finding. That is what forensic accounting requires. That is what professional integrity requires. That is what the law requires. I found what I found 4 years ago, and I reported it because I was obligated to report it, and because the clients who had been stolen from deserved to have the truth told on their behalf. That decision cost me 4 years with my daughter and an indefinite period with my son-in-law and a graduation ceremony that I watched from a park bench in Burlington rather than from a seat in a university auditorium. I would make the same decision again, not because it did not hurt, because it was right. What I want to say to any person who has done the right thing and paid a personal price for it that they did not expect and did not deserve is this: the price is not the end of the story. The price is part of the story, and the rest of the story has not been written yet. Emma called me last Tuesday. She had a question about a client engagement at the firm, a financial pattern that didn't look right and that she wasn't sure how to interpret. She described what she had found in careful detail and asked what I thought it meant. I thought about it for a moment. Then I told her what I saw. She said, "That's what I thought too. I wanted to make sure." I said, "Trust the numbers. They don't lie." She said, "That's what you always told me." I said, "It was the first thing my father told me." She said, "I'll call you if I find anything." I said, "I'll be here." The best move is the one they never saw coming. Tell me in the comments, have you ever done the right thing and paid a price you didn't expect? I want to hear from you.